Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Parker. I'm the Executive Director for the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Betsy Sweeney, who is the Director of Heritage Programming at Wheeling Heritage, and she's also sits on the Board of Directors for the Preservation Alliance. Today, she'll be talking about a technical topic, Rat's Nest, a Hoard of Information. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can submit those through the questions tab, or if you're having any technical difficulties, you can submit those through the chat or the questions bars, and I can respond to those. We'll take questions at the end as well and have a chance to answer those. So I'm going to hand it right over to Betsy, and thank you again for joining us, and thanks, Betsy, for being a part of our webinar today.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. As I said, we'll be talking about rat's nests and how they can benefit you in different preservation activities. So as Danielle said, I'm currently the Director of Heritage Programming with Wheeling Heritage, which operates the Wheeling National Heritage Area. And we spend a lot of our time interpreting the history and stories of our heritage area and assisting with historic preservation. But prior to relocating to Wheeling in 2018, I was working in Virginia as an architectural historian, mainly at James Madison's Montpelier and around the Piedmont region as an architectural historian. So a lot of the information I'm sharing with you today actually comes from that background where preservation and restoration was taking place and trying to answer many questions about who had lived in these buildings and homes that we were looking at. So, sorry, was I muted there? Okay. Today we'll be talking about rat's nests and why they are important. So rat's nests are important because they are incredibly prolific. Rats are second in population on the earth only to humans. So it's very easy to find one in a building that you're dealing with. They hoard everyday objects. So the things that human beings have historically had in their homes and chosen to have in their homes, rats like to take. So they're filling in a part of the archaeological record that is often absent. As I said, they're extremely common, they're easy to find, and they tend to collect ephemeral material. So paper, advertisements, letters, things that are typical to a specific point in time and also of a material that would otherwise be lost if it was left to the archaeological record. So a lot of the material culture we study of human occupation is stuff that was either discarded or somehow made its way into the ground, and some of those materials will then disintegrate or dissolve. The beauty of rat's nests is that materials like paper, textiles, food items, some of those other organic or soft materials are able to survive in these contexts and provide information that would otherwise be lost. So a little background in looking at rat's nests as a research method and a place where you can learn more about the material culture of your population. Up until around the 1990s, rat's nests were typically discarded. If you found one in a preservation or restoration setting, it was usually met with disdain or disgust, not excitement for the opportunity for further study. Travis McDonald of Poplar Forest was really one of the first scholars to publish on the topic of rat's nests, and his article, Rat Housing in Middle Virginia, is kind of considered the most important work and really lays out a methodology and an analysis for how to collect and evaluate the material found in a rat's nest. His work at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest in addition to the work done at James Madison's Montpelier and the historic Charleston Foundation's work on the Nathaniel Russell House, will provide 3 case studies that we'll talk through today. And they'll be going in chronological order. So generally, this kind of work really started at Poplar Forest, and then it's proven to be quite useful throughout restoration projects. So first, looking at Poplar Forest, we see kind of the beginning of this field of study. And Poplar Forest was Thomas Jefferson's country retreat or vacation estate, however you want to think of it, throughout his lifetime. And then not long after the Jefferson occupation ended, the property and the house actually burned. So because it was constructed of brick and many of the interior walls were masonry, much of it survived, but any wood fragments, framing, and certainly any rat's nests from that period were lost. But then the subsequent owners and treatment of the property was largely unknown. And so it was through this restoration effort and architectural investigation that really getting creative and trying to rely on any source of data available led to this deep investigation of rat's nests. So at Poplar Forest, one of the really important works discovered was in relation to landscapes and how they could take the distance of material found to the furthest point from which it could have been gathered or hoarded, and determining the organic materials that were found, so seeds and nuts and things like that, to match that up with the landscape changes over time. So as you can see in the photo, the landscape has been largely restored, and they're working to continue that work, and much of that has been informed by these kind of seemingly inconsequential nests. That much of the work at Poplar Forest happened in the late 90s through the mid 2000s and continues to this day. So moving in chronological order, another really significant historical site that's utilized this methodology is Montpelier. So Montpelier, the home of President James Madison, was in the Madison family through his retirement and then ultimately his death. Dolly Madison sells the property several years after. And from that point until the mid 20th century, it cycles through several owners that make dramatic changes each step of the way. By the 1980s, the DuPont family had owned it through much of the 20th century and ultimately sold the property to the National Trust. And it was during that time that the National Trust began an architectural investigation to determine how much of the building was original and if it could be restored. And then it was during that restoration process through the early 2000s that, again, this need for extra data that wasn't immediately available allowed for a creative investigation to better inform what needed to be done. So this house that had had so many 20th century additions, it had doubled in size, all needed to be peeled away. There were very few historical accounts of the interior appearance of the building during the Madison's lifetime, and yet there was a foundation goal of restoring it to that appearance. So in this photo, you can see a 20th century wall covered in very kind of the era wallpaper, and then an investigation panel cut beneath where the architectural historians at work are removing a rat's nest to be cataloged. And so this kind of work was done all over the house and cataloged and kind of set to the side until the rest of the restoration was complete. So everything was peeled away, the house was restored, the floor plan was back to its early 19th century appearance when the Madisons were living there. And they have accounts of the drawing room, which would have been the most publicly visible room in the home, that say things like, it was opulently decorated, there was art and painting on the wall, it was the place we gathered before and after dinners, things like that, but nothing to describe what it actually looked at. So architectural historians went back to those rat's nests and did a thorough analysis and were able to find one scrap of red flocked wallpaper in the nest, which informed the wall covering of that room. So by taking that sample, they were able to send it to a textile historian that knew that the material, the dye, and the weave of the paper and the flocking was so opulent that if the Madisons did in fact own that material, the only room it would have been installed in was the drawing room, which allowed for the product that you see today, which is really all thanks to one little rat's nest. Another example, which is one that I've worked very closely on personally, is coming from a later context. The 20th century brought about new parcels of land being acquired and wrapped into the Montpelier property, and one of them included a 19th century plantation and slave quarter of a much smaller scale. And in that slave quarter, there had been many decades of addition and changes in ownership and changes in occupancy. And we were able to collect a rat's nest from under the window that revealed this artifact, a fully intact knife with initials carved in it, that until that point we had no names associated with this quarter. And those initials were enough to match up with some of the census records from the 1850s to begin to determine the genealogy of those that had occupied that building. And again, we were at a loss until we had that rat's nest. Finally, today, this work is current and ongoing, and if anyone is in Charleston, I encourage you to stop by. The Nathaniel Russell House, which is owned and operated by the Historic Charleston Foundation, is also employing this technology to evaluate their kitchen house quarter, which is the kitchen and living quarters for the Nathaniel Russell House, which would have been operated and occupied by his enslaved domestic laborers. This was a building that had been otherwise kind of overlooked and thought to be void of any historic material, but after closer examination, they recognized that much of it had just been covered, and in that uncovering process, they found many, many rat's nests, which to date are the only sources of material culture from the context of that building. So things like seeds and plant matter are helping to inform the diet and the materials used in that kitchen, as well as textiles and fabrics, which will help inform how the people that were living on the upper story were able to have access to things like fabric for their own clothes, materials in their home spaces, bed coverings, window coverings, things of that nature. So before we talk about the how of how to evaluate these nests, I want to talk a bit about the little guys that make them. So mostly we will be talking about brown and black rats, but to a lesser extent also the pack rat. And the black rat is our earliest rat here in the United States. It came over with the Pilgrims, think Salem, think Plymouth, and there are many, many historic accounts saying how detrimental they were on the ships coming over and how compromised their food supply and things of that nature were because of these rats. So we see this long history of, I don't know, sort of tumultuous cohabitation between humans and rats. Your black rats are a little bit smaller, but they have longer tails, and they will nest on in higher places. So if you find one in the attic, if you find one in a joist pocket or between studs on your second story, oftentimes that is a black rat. Your brown rats are a little bit chunkier in appearance, a little bit bigger, and have a shorter tail. And they are by and large the most common rat you'll encounter in the United States. They're incredibly populous. They can reproduce at an astounding rate, and they do both ground burrowing and nesting in structures. If you find a nest lower in your home or outbuilding, it's likely due to a brown rat. And when we think of like a rat in New York City or a rat that's by a dumpster, that's your common brown rat. Pack rats are slightly less common, even though they're certainly the most famous. People think of them immediately when we talk about these sorts of topics, but they're not quite as common. And if you do come face to face with one, you can distinguish it by its kind of short, squat, fluffier appearance. They're a little bit cuter, if you can say that. And they're more common out west, generally speaking. All three can cohabitate together, but in a lot of areas of the country, you're dealing just with the brown rat. The other important thing to know about all three of these guys is that when they nest, there is a specific area from which they will pull materials for that nest. So between 100 and 150 feet is the furthest edge of a radius that a rat will go to take materials to bring back to its nest, which will become incredibly helpful when you're dealing with a larger property and you're trying to locate materials that to figure out where they were taken from and where they ended up. And particularly if you're in a house that's very large with multiple nests, you can start to cross-reference and co-locate artifacts as it relates to the spaces of that house. So you may find a toy on the south wing first floor and a part of a bottle on the north wing third floor, and it can help you figure out room use and occupancy and all different things like that. So that 100 to 150 feet is an important thing to keep in mind. And as I said earlier, throughout history, throughout human history, everyone has had rats. So this is a quote that I find amusing from an early Virginia landowner talking about how rats were behind his wainscot, and in this journal entry he goes on to say how they're in the rafters in the basement and compromising his dry goods storage. So we know that they're there. We might as well utilize the information they've left for us. Finding nests is not particularly difficult, especially if you're already undertaking some kind of restoration or preservation activity. So if you are a museum or just an independent homeowner that's opening up a wall anyway, it's really important to take the time to kind of look for these nested areas anywhere, especially in a wood structure where you have a wall cavity. So areas, framing pockets, the space between your brick and your plaster, areas beneath windows or above windows are very popular. Anytime there's a void in your building, it's asking for a little rat to find its home there. So if any of those places are being opened up, this is your opportunity to look. And when you're doing so, my picture is a bad illustration of this, but when you are looking and if you find a rat's nest, it's really important to wear protective gear, especially if it might not be a rat's nest from the distant past. If it's more recent, you are dealing with organic material, with animal material. There's all sorts of diseases and germs that can be associated with these things. So it's important to cover your hands, wear a respirator, and even eye coverings if you're working from above your eye level. And then the other thing that's important when you do collect them is to try to get everything. Don't just take a portion of the nest, try to remove the whole thing, and collect one at a time and label where you found it from, when you found it, and separate your findings nest by nest. Because as I said, if you get into a situation where you're tearing apart a whole house or you're just working over a very large area, it can be helpful down the line if you have one from opposite ends. So always label well. And then once you've extracted your nest, it becomes very much like inside archaeology or interior archaeology, which we sometimes talk about when we talk about opening up walls and peeling back plaster or wallpaper. Well, this is just like that, but it's taking it a step further, and it's rat archaeology. So you'll have this whole nest that you've bagged and labeled and mapped. And then when you're ready to analyze it, you'll want to find a flat surface where you have good lighting and a controlled space and spread everything out on your surface. You'll have a whole mixture of things, and until you start to really go through it, it can all kind of look like trash. But as you separate out, you'll begin by taking two categories of artifacts, things that are man-made and coming from a human context, and non-artifacts or natural materials, things that are clearly not associated with human use, but came from the natural world. And then within those categories, there are oftentimes some common or recurring types. So of the man-made or artifact category, there's almost always paper, newspaper, letters, magazine, cardboard, packaging, things of that nature show up pretty frequently. Fabrics, both upholstery and textile materials, as well as clothing fabrics, are often really present. And then wool, if it's available, is for some reason a desired material, so you'll often have a disproportionate amount of your fabric belonging to the wool category. And if you're from a very old context, you can actually take the wool and do some analysis to figure out types of animal and breed and highly specific things. Metals, which you wouldn't think would automatically be included, are actually more common than we would think, and it's not totally understood why rats are so inclined to take these materials, but you'll often find them, things like straight pins, safety pins, silverware. In this picture, there's even a tin can. Those all can appear. And then miscellaneous objects. This is where you'll find some fun stuff like marbles or checkers, small toys, pens, really jewelry. I mean, anything you can think of. Rats do not discriminate, and they don't care what you hope to lose or hope not to. So sometimes there's some really interesting stuff in there. And then in your non-artifact pile, there will be a lot of wood and straw and nesting material, as well as larger pieces of wood that are incorporated into the nest for gnawing purposes. So rats spend a good portion of their day gnawing to keep their teeth from becoming too sharp or too long. So sometimes there are large pieces, like pieces of furniture that have fallen off or become loose, architectural pieces, shingles if you're in a roof situation, pieces of spindles, you name it. And that can be really helpful in a really refined restoration setting where that might be the only piece of architectural evidence from that era that you come across. Food, so food sources both from the human occupancy and for the rats that are making the nest are really common. There'll be lots of seeds, peach pits, cherry pits, nuts, things of that nature will be really present and also can tell you a lot about both the landscape and the food sources that were happening at that property. And then again, miscellaneous material. You may find straw, you may find leaves, you may find wood chips, some other unexpected material found from the outside world. And then sometimes you'll even find the rat, which is always a surprise and not always a fun one, but we know that rats will reuse or recycle nests for several generations. They don't span more than a few generations, but when you do find the rat, it's pretty good evidence that that was the last occupant of that nesting area, and then any others either were eliminated by way of pest removal or simply moved on, or they moved to a different part of the house. So sometimes if you find one, it's evidence that you need to keep looking for the next nest. And then once everything is sorted out and looks more like this, you can start to analyze and hopefully glean some new information about either the people or the visitors or whatever context you're trying to learn more about. So paper is a really great one. It's not super common that you get a whole letter or even enough of a letter that is readable, but sometimes you'll get a date in the corner. And even better is newspaper fragments, because those often can be paired to the newspaper collection of your local town or county. And if those are digitized, you can use those scraps, the scrap that contains the wording, to do a search to try to match that piece against a digitized volume and understand more about the date, the time, the topic that was being covered in that period of time. Fabric is also really great because in this context of rat archaeology, if you will, fabric can be used to date much like ceramics are in archaeology. So we know that there are certain date markers associated with the method of manufacturing or weaving certain fabrics, as well as some really obvious stylistic and thematic markers of fabrics. It's pretty easy to pull out a piece and see that's floral from the 60s versus some rough woven earlier material. Again, the same thing with wool. You can look at the method of production in any wool cloth and learn more about where it came from, how it was manufactured, if it was handmade, if it was machine made, and it can give you dates as well. As I illustrated earlier with my story about the knife, metal can also be present in unexpected places, and that can be everything from buttons to small pieces of cans or even whole cans that can tell you more about the occupants' foodways. We see lots of tins with salve or cosmetics from earlier times that can tell you about who was living in the home and how they were navigating their personal wellness and cosmetic interests. And miscellaneous is always really fun, and there are many cases of finding things like small children's toys or specific prescription containers or bottles that can tell you if there were children living in the home, or if one of the occupants suffered from a certain ailment that had a prescribed remedy. These objects that are taken, like I said, they're things that people were using, and they're not necessarily things they decided to discard. In many cases, they're things that were taken from them. So it offers that day-to-day insight in a way that we typically don't see, because as I said, if it's found archaeologically, it was discarded, it ended up on the ground, and then it ended up in the ground. Or the other end of the spectrum is if something is purposefully collected through family heirlooms, historical societies, or willed artifacts. Those are things that have been given the highest priority in a person's life, but these are a window into the everyday. Your non-artifacts, your natural things, food, wood, and miscellaneous, are again examples of just how rats are taking things that show us the day-to-day life of the occupants in this building. So food in particular can be really interesting when looking at trade, commerce, and access to resources. There are many kinds of fruit pits and seeds that are not coming from trees or bushes or whatever that would grow easily on certain properties. So if there's a high quantity of those kind of items showing up, it's a pretty good indicator that that family or that business or whatever was importing certain resources and likely had an economic access that allowed for those types of behaviors, just like the absence of them can give some insight into a lack of resources. Wood is particularly interesting as well, because as I said, the gnawing that is required for these animals means that they are constantly just kind of scrapping little pieces of wood and bringing them into their spaces. And so there have been cases where a black rat nest was found in the upper eaves of a smokehouse, that had been long lost to renovation and restoration, and there had been metal roofing and asphalt shingles and no roof, and there was really no evidence left of the shape, material, or profile of the wood shingles that had historically been on that building until a rat's nest revealed one fragment of one original wood shingle, which allowed for basically the model of the restoration material that was ultimately selected. And again, with miscellaneous, you never know what you'll find in there, and it might be the missing piece of the puzzle. So for anyone that is opening up a part of their historic building, I encourage you to look for these little nests and take the time to go through them and analyze their contents. You don't have to do it right away. You can simply put a nest in any acid-free clear storage bag and set it to the side until you're ready to look at it. But properly storing and labeling nests as you find them only makes life easier for you in the future. And documenting where they came from, and then once you go through them, taking photographs and noting quantities and materials of the contents makes it much easier to reference any data that you do find out. And then if you are coming from a museum context or a historical society or any public-facing building, even city or county civic buildings, anytime someone's going to have eyes on your big renovation, restoration, or preservation project, I really encourage the display of these things. We had several versions of this, but I have pictured one of the more recent exhibits that I worked on that just showed the sort of behind the scenes artifacts that were found in rats' nests that informed the interpretation and restoration of Montpelier. And it was one of our most well-attended and engaging exhibitions that we had. We had a ton of feedback, and it allowed for a lot of children's programming and a lot of intrigue from otherwise uninterested adults. So it's not very hard to spread this stuff out on a white background and put some glass over it. And I encourage everyone to display the treasures of their nests. So that is about it for me. This was originally going to be an in-person program at the conference, and I had hoped to do some hands-on kind of analysis. So for the sake of time and not being able to see you all, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. That was really interesting and a unique discussion. We can open it up now to any questions that anyone may have. Give it a few minutes here. And we also will be adding this online to the Preservation Alliance YouTube channel in the next couple days. So if you want to share this information or watch it again, feel free to do so. And you can visit our website at P as in Paul, A as in Apple, W, V as in Victor.org to check out the webinar archive that we have that is directed to the YouTube channel. So I haven't had any questions come in just yet, but I know sometimes it takes folks a moment to type them, or if you want to raise your hand and ask them directly, we can open up the microphones for anybody. Well, I don't see anything coming through, but Betsy, they can also contact you, right, at the Wheeling Heritage offices if they need to.
That's right. My email is on the Wheeling Heritage website, and it's also B as in Betsy, Sweeney, SWEENY at wheelingheritage.org. So I'm easy to find.
Okay, and there has been one question that's come in. You mentioned PPP while removing the nest. Are there concerns about contamination in long-term storage?
Yeah, so the biggest concern is inhaling any of the particles associated with the nests because there is animal material in there. But long-term storage, as long as it's in a sealed container and when you do take it out, you're handling it with gloves, I think that it's relatively low risk. I will say with these kinds of materials, they're in a way almost mummified. And so as long as when you take them out, they are dry, and if they're not, give them the opportunity to dry. But as long as the materials are dry, which they typically will be, they can be stored in an airtight situation. You don't need to worry about the ventilation or having it in a cloth bag or something like that.
Says thanks. They were curious if there was protocol for labeling the material in catalogs or on the shelf.
Not really. Labeling really doesn't deviate from just regular kind of collections management best practices. So you'll want to use one uniform labeling system and naming convention. Make sure that the writing materials and labels that you use are acid free and come from a reputable source. Don't go to Joann Fabrics and buy stickers. Like, buy archival materials. And then just sort by artifact type and then material, and treat it very much like a regular collection. Use gloves when you handle them, and store in an airtight container so as not to circulate any of that stuff through the air. That's about it.
Okay, well, that's all we have for today. So thank you again, Betsy, and thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Next week's webinar will be Ask the Expert, where we'll have the opportunity to talk with a couple of experts in historic preservation trades about problem areas like masonry and historic windows. So feel free to join us again next week and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.